November 22nd marked the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination. Coming up, from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, a conference disputing the U.S. government's official findings on JFK's murder. First, Mark Lane, an attorney and author of Rush to Judgment, on the complicity of the Secret Service in the assassination of the president. He's followed by Temple University professor Joan Mellen. She examines the prosecution of Clay Shaw by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Mr. Shaw was a New Orleans businessman and the only person ever prosecuted in connection with the assassination. This portion of the conference is just under 2 hours.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you here. And my name is Mark Lane, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the assassination of President Kennedy. I may be the only person here who actually knew John Kennedy. Back in 1960, well, the end of 59, I was running from my office in East Harlem, New York, for membership in the New York State Legislature. And I actually was also, in that campaign, the campaign manager for John Kennedy for president in the New York City area. So I had an opportunity to talk with him and meet with him. More closely than that relationship was my relationship with Bobby Kennedy, because Bobby was running the campaign. And we spent a lot of time, a great deal of time together. The problem was that the liberals in New York did not like John Kennedy. They wanted Adlai Stevenson, someone they thought they could trust, and they said about John Kennedy, because I was at many of those meetings, and they said about John Kennedy, well, other people believe because he's Catholic, he actually should not be elected president, etc. They always said these other people. I never saw the other people. I just saw them and heard them, and I knew the other people were them. And that was disturbing to me. So I arranged a meeting with these liberals from the West Side. I was very active politically then, and I brought together all these guys and women, mostly guys, and with Bobby Kennedy, so they could meet him. And they were only concerned, most of them supported Adlai Stevenson, but they were mostly concerned about what would happen to their clubs. They were Reformed Democratic clubs. How would John Kennedy, if he was elected president, treat their clubs? Well, you could not expect that this was a reform movement, an insurgent movement inside of the Democratic Party. I was one of the founders of that with Eleanor Roosevelt and Senator Lehman, and you could not expect the Democratic Party to say, yes, we're going to endorse the insurgents against the rest of the party. So we never expected that. But some of the folks there said to Robert Kennedy at that meeting, what will happen to our clubs if John Kennedy is elected president? What will he do about us? And Bobby, who was thought of as being somewhat ruthless, and that image was not contradicted by his answer, which was, I want my brother to be elected president. After that, I don't care if blood runs in the streets of New York. And people were horrified, but I met with him in a suite of rooms which were maintained by the Kennedy brothers in New York City, sort of a secret meeting place for, well, whatever. We talked about it, and they said, he's absolutely ruthless. I said, yeah, but what did he say? I mean, it could have been placed somewhat more gently and somewhat more tactfully than the reference to blood running in the streets, but what he was saying is it's hands off. And we will take no position. what more could we possibly want from a guy who's going to be the nominee? You can't expect the nominee of the Democratic Party to be supporting our little group against the rest of the Democratic Party. So if you set aside the concept of blood in the street, just think about what he was really saying. And we ended up, I went to the Democratic clubs and we ended up voting, and we almost won unanimously. There was one in the 10th Assembly District North, which we won, but in the one in the 10th Assembly District South, there was a vote, and we endorsed John Kennedy, something like 150 to 1, something like that. That one was a Democratic district leader there. But so the campaign began, and I worked really closely with Bobby during that campaign, and I was also running for the state legislature. And John came into my district and stood with me and campaigned with me that day in my district, and we took photographs and put them in the window, life-size pictures, and people thought, they thought it was John Kennedy when they drove by. It was life-size picture. I don't know why they thought that. It was in black and white, but I thought it was pretty clear it was a picture, but in any event, that's how that went on. Then, of course, he was gone very, very quickly, and we were not prepared for that. And the media, of course, immediately jumped on the statements made by the government that one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, had killed President Kennedy. But they did more than that, those in power. They said quietly to Earl Warren, I have all those documents now. I spent years of my life in the courts bringing Freedom of Information Act actions in which we received actually tens and tens and tens of thousands of pages which had been classified, but now here they all were. They came in 2 trucks to my office in New York, in Washington. And we had assembled a group of students. A lot of them were from Sarah Lawrence, but from other colleges. We had a large number of kids there. And they would take a class to have some understanding about what it is we were looking for. And there they were, sprawling over the whole house with documents. Every once in a while, someone would say, listen to this, and it would be some really important document. And that's the way that worked. So it was a democratic operation in terms of scope, and we uncovered a lot of information which was very useful. The government has 2 ways of doing things with information. They hide it, that's one thing, and secondly, if they decide they have to produce it, and they had to in this case, because I went before the United States District Court, and I said, Your Honor, the government says that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed the president. They also say that there are issues of national security, which is why these documents cannot be released. Well, which is it? If he did it alone, and that's the end of the case, how can there be an issue of national security involved? And the judge agreed and ordered that the documents be released, and then we got, not all of them, but enough so that we were swamped. And that's also an effort made by the government. They gave us documents which had nothing to do with anything related to Dallas in November of '63. A meeting about Jack Kennedy's trip to Paris to do this. I mean, thousands and thousands of things. It's like the thing is, if you're looking. This is the story in New York. We always used to say, if you want the address of someone and the court orders them to give it to you, they give you the Manhattan telephone book. It's in there. And so you can be swamped with material and still not get the information. But we had these kids from all over, and they were looking through, and they were finding gems. And that was the first series of breaks on that question. The interesting thing when you go back and look at the material now is to see what the government was saying. J. Lee Rankin was chosen to be the general counsel of the Warren Commission, and he met with the New York Times even before he was chosen, because everybody knew he was going to be their choice. I think it was November 25th, 1963, in the New York Times. He said, I believe that's the date, he said, was quoted as saying, "Our job here is to reassure the American people." Well, okay, how about shots came from different directions? We don't know who did it. The killers are still out there someplace in America. We don't know who they are. Or, the truth, we do know it was the Central Intelligence Agency. And any explanation other than one man did it alone and he's dead would not have been reassuring. The only reassurance was that that case is solved and the culprit is gone. And that is how that took place. And Warren was aware of this, of course. At an early press conference, a reporter said to him, he was coming out of this meeting, I lived in Washington then, and on Capitol Hill, and just a block away was the Veterans of Foreign Wars building, which is where they met, those initial meetings of the commission. And he came out of that building and said that, when a reporter said, "When will we get the facts, Mr. Chief Justice?" And he said, "You will never get the facts in your lifetime." That's an open, free, democratic society. We saw our president's head blown apart on a bright, sunny day in the middle of the United States, the middle of Dallas, with people watching. And we were not entitled to find out or be told by the government what their evidence was. Well, that was their position. We had another one, and we went to court. And as I said, the judge was confronted with these motions to make all these documents available. And he said, well, how do you answer Mr. Lane's statements that you are taking the position, one person did it and he's gone, with the fact that there are documents that it would impact on national security, if that is the whole story. And they really couldn't answer that. And then we got the documents, and the documents were extremely useful in helping to look into what happened that day. Some of the coverage was really interesting, and some of the things which were published just before the assassination were also interesting. This is the New York Times, Arthur Kroc. Probably nobody here remembers Arthur Kroc. Arthur Kroc was the key to getting into the White House from the news media. Arthur Kroc was very close to John Kennedy's father. Arthur Kroc was a very conservative author, writer, and a reporter, very conservative, and so was Joe Kennedy. So was John Kennedy's father. And they had a political alliance of sorts, and he was, Kennedy's father was always the source of information when Kroc wrote. And this is what Kroc wrote on, published in the New York Times on October 3rd, 1963. A very high American official, and he was talking about John Kennedy, has said the CIA's growth was likened to a malignancy, which was the very high official was not sure even the White House could control. And this very high official, probably the president, said, and it was published, as I say, in the New York Times on October 3rd, 63, if the United States ever experiences an attempt at a coup to overthrow the government, it will come from the CIA and not the Pentagon. The CIA represents a tremendous power and total unaccountability to anyone. That's what was said in October, and the president was killed the following month. And the Warren Commission never called Arthur Kroc to ask him who the official was, how come he could predict the assassination a month before it took place, or predict that there's going to be something happening, and who the high official was. High official was John Kennedy, but that has not been said. And so we have the government issuing a statement which is untrue, and then we have the news media accepting it and allowing no dissent. No dissent for 1 year, a full year, after the assassination of the president. Not one question was asked of the government or published anywhere in any newspaper, radio station, television station. Not one question about the validity of the government's investigation. Not one question. I'd like to believe that now with the internet and instant communication we have all around the whole world, that if that happened today, it would be very hard to keep it secret. But you can count on the fact that people will continue to try that if events have to be covered up from their viewpoint. And as I said, their statement was that it was, our position is that we must reassure the American people. And Earl Warren came out, and when he was asked, when will we get the truth? He said, you may never get it in your lifetime. Hundreds of thousands of Americans might die if the facts came out. And so everybody was terrified. The hundreds of thousands of Americans he was talking about was World War III, which was going to break out if they told the truth. This was what the Warren Commission was told. It took me years to get transcripts of the in-house meetings of the commission, but this is what they were told. That Lee Harvey Oswald, according to the CIA, went to Mexico City in October 1963. He then visited the two agencies there. He visited the Soviet embassy, it was in the Soviet Union, and the Cuban embassy. And it's clear that he was planning, after he killed, this was in October, he was there, they said, he was planning to go to Cuba, and from Cuba, go from Mexico City after the assassination, Oswald was, to go to Cuba from Mexico City and then fly on to the Soviet Union. That's the story that was told to the Warren Commission. And the CIA went on to say, however, we don't believe that the Russians or the Cubans were in any way involved. But if the story gets out, people will not believe us, and that's why hundreds of thousands of Americans will die in a war which is going to take place. That's what they told Earl Warren, and scared him. He really was frightened by this. The problem is the story was a fabrication. Oswald had not been to Mexico City. The person who designed that whole story was a man named David Atlee Phillips, who ran the Central Intelligence Agency for the entire hemisphere from his office in Mexico City. And not long before he died, last several years ago, he said, he spoke at USC, and I was on the program with him, and he said that, in fact, Oswald never was in Mexico City, which destroyed the entire story, which had been told to the Warren Commission. And when that was reported, an apologist for the Warren Commission said, well, it was because, yes, he said it. We can't deny that he said it. But this is very well publicized, his statement. But the fact is that Mark Lane had subjected him to a cruel, grueling cross-examination and confused him, and that's why he said it. It was a meeting at USC. I was on the panel, and he was on the panel. I directed no question to him at all, and a student got up at the end and raised a subject which I had not, and was, "Can you tell us about Mexico City, Mr. Phillips?" There was no cross-examination, and it was just a kid asking the question, and that's when Phillips then said Oswald was never there. And so the cover-up was that I had subjected him to this cross-examination. I didn't ask him anything, and it was a student who said it, but that became the mantra of the establishment to try to explain how the man who ran the Central Intelligence Agency for the United States and elsewhere, and did it from his office in Mexico City, made that statement because of my brilliant cross-examination, although I never asked him a question. And so here we are now, 50 years later, almost 50 years later, and there still are files which are classified. We don't even know the number, but we know they're in the tens of thousands of documents. They're classified because of reasons of national security, which obviously makes no sense 50 years later. Never made any sense at the time because they were saying that one man did it alone anyway. But even if it made some sense then, now what issue of national security can possibly be involved? Well, there's a question of CIA security. And if the American people were told then, or even told now, the truth about who killed their president, that would be the end of the CIA. Most of the people who were involved are dead, in fact, maybe all of them, but, and I know some names, but I don't, I'm a lawyer, and I believe in our system of justice. And I've never spoken out the name of any one individual who I believe is a suspect in the case, because I think that our system is, nobody is guilty in this country. Each person is presumed to be innocent, even when indicted. And it is unfair to give up our whole judicial system in this one instance by saying, yes, so-and-so probably did it. Guilt is determined by a jury or a plea of guilty, or if you waive a jury, a judge. But it's after a judicial proceeding, and that is crucial to who we are. And not every country has this blessing, which was handed down to us by the founders at the very beginning in the First Amendment. The single most important sentence in American history. And it gives us, it's important to remember the First Amendment gives us no rights. People say, well, it's free speech and freedom from religious oppression and freedom of assembly, right to assemble peaceably. But the First Amendment does not give us those rights. Remember how it begins. Congress shall make no law. And it goes on talking about our rights, our inalienable rights. So the First Amendment gives us nothing. The First Amendment says we have those rights, and the government can never take those rights away. It's important to remember, there's a distinction there. It's important to remember that the founders believed that these rights were inherent. We had fought a revolution, and this was soon after that. And when the First Amendment was drafted, and it was a statement of who we are. See, I believe that I don't believe in the Pledge of Allegiance that kids have to do. I don't know if they still do. We did it all the time in school. I don't believe that that's as important because it tells us that we're loyal to something. It's not as important as the First Amendment, which tells us who we are. And if anything has to be recited in schools, It should be the First Amendment, single most important sentence in the history of our nation, reaffirming our basic rights. And so here we are 50 years, almost 50 years later. The remarkable thing is that for a year, not one person was allowed to say anything. The only way I traveled all around the country, of course, and I lectured, and I was on local radio stations. The only way I got into more than one city with a talk was when I was in Canada and in Windsor, and it was broadcast by CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Company, into the border cities like Detroit and others. That was the only way I was able to reach Americans in more than one city at the same time. And there was a panic here that if the American people found out some terrible thing would happen, a revolution, we were much closer then and we are now to falling asleep through apathy than rising on our feet to bring about a revolution. I mean, it's not even on the agenda. It never has been since the 18th century, actually. So so here we are all these years later, looking back at this, and why is that? I felt there were a lot of different ways to try to get the attention of the country focused on this and try to get some information. And first, through the courts, Freedom of Information Act, then executive activity. I appeared twice before the Warren Commission, the only person to do that, and talked to them about what the facts were. And then I thought there might be another way, and that would be through the Congress. So I went to see a friend of mine named Herman Badillo, who was a congressman and from the community where I was active in New York. I helped a lot in his campaign. And I went to see him and I said, Herman, I'd like to have the Congress investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. And he said, you're serious? And I said, yeah. Why? Isn't this a serious matter? He said, you know, we're not a grand jury. We don't investigate crimes. He said, what do you have there? And I said, it's a petition for members of Congress to sign. I want to get 100 of them, and then I want it to be raised on the floor to set up the House. Well, we didn't have a name for it then, but a committee to investigate the assassination. Later became the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and went into the assassinations of both President Kennedy and Dr. King. And he said, you won't find one member of Congress who will sign it. I said, I know one who will sign it. He said, who? I said, you. And he signed it. And I spent the next months going to move to Washington, got a place right across the street from the, on 2nd Street, as close as you could get to the Capitol, and spent a lot of time visiting with members of Congress. I got more than 100 signatures of Congress. And one person came up to me, and I wasn't going to even see him. He was a guy from Southern Virginia, and Republican, and very, very conservative. And he said, Mr. Lane, you didn't come to see, he came to my office. So, Mr. Lane, you didn't come to see me. I said, would you be interested in this? And he said, yes, I want to sign it. And I said, why? Fine, wonderful. Why do you want to sign it? And he said, and these are the words which stick with me all these years later, and is the reason why I think we still have to keep looking at these facts until we get all of the information out to all of the American people. He said, I want to sign it because because members of Congress saying, this is settled. This is old stuff. It's all settled. And he said, I want to sign your petition because I believe nothing is settled until it is properly settled. And that has then became our slogan, and we raised that with members of Congress, and we actually got more than 100 people to sign it, and then we got a vote in the House of Representatives. And I was there with my paralegal up in the mezzanine first seat, first row, looking right down on the Congress when they voted. And I gave my wallet and all my personal possessions to my paralegal, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "If they defeat this, I'm going to stand up and say, shame, shame on you, and they'll arrest me and take me out of there. I know, so you got my stuff here." And there we were waiting, and the votes came in, and then it passed, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations was set up, and Don Edwards, who had been an FBI, a special agent of the FBI before he became a member of Congress. He was a liberal, but he had worked for the FBI before that. He stood up and said, looking at me, he said, "This should be called the Mark Lane Bill." So it hasn't been called that. And it was good enough that it was called, because then a committee was set up and the Congress conducted an investigation. And the conclusion was that, well, they were afraid of anything too definite, but the conclusion was that by the House that there was some doubt about who killed the president, and probably there was a conspiracy involved. Well, that was a huge, huge step forward. Not the end that we had hoped for, but it was much more than we thought could ever be achieved. And so sometimes democracy works right here in America. I mean, if it doesn't work here, I tell you, it's not going to work anywhere. I mean, even now, when just think about how this country started. I mean, Tom Brokaw referred to, well, my generation as the greatest generation. But of course, that's not true. The greatest generation had as its members Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Tom Paine, and many others who founded this country so that the rest of us could carry on. And when I went to see members of Congress, I wore this pin. I don't wear any jewelry, but I wore this this pin. It's the only jewelry I ever have worn. It's those of us who served in the United States Army during World War II, when we were honorably discharged, we were given a document saying we have been honorably discharged, and given this pin, which goes with it. It's what it means. It's a gold eagle, actually brass, but it's a gold-looking eagle, which means that you have been honorably discharged for your service to your country during World War II. And we sometimes see each other in the streets, very few anymore, with this pin on. We recognize each other. In the days just after the war, there were a lot of people wearing this, but people have sort of forgotten and been focusing on other matters. So here we are. What are we going to do now about this? It's hard to say because it's history. It's still an issue for us. But it's history now, and minds have been set. But it's interesting to see that the latest polls show that more people. This is a poll about a month ago, Gallup or Harris, one of those nationally accepted polls, said that more people believe that the CIA was involved in the assassination than believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. So that's an important step but and it showed that the majority, sizable majority of the American people believe there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. They don't all believe the CIA was involved, but they believe there was a conspiracy to kill the President of the United States. So we've made a lot of progress over the years, but it's not over yet, because, as the Congressman told us, nothing is settled until it's settled properly. The honor of France was restored when the French government said that Dreyfus was innocent. Until then, its honor was in doubt, as is ours, and as ours has been for all of these years, with the government refusing to disclose its own role in the murder of our president. It hasn't stopped the American people, as every survey shows, from reaching a different conclusion, but it would be good if the government caught up with us. There's always a time lag there, and it's been 50 years now, so it's a long span of this time lag, but it's important still, I believe, because, as we were told, nothing's settled until it's settled properly. The sad part of all of this is that basically no one in the media has raised these issues seriously. There was one person who I had the greatest respect for, of all the reporters I ever met, and I knew a lot of them, was Peter Keese of the New York Times, who I think was the best reporter ever in my lifetime for the New York Times, and he was a conservative guy. And he never, I've had many meetings with him, he never really believed that there was a conspiracy, but he really deeply believed that there were important issues which had to be presented to the American people, and that the New York Times should be taking a leadership position in doing that. And he helped a great deal. If you go back over the only decent stories the New York Times ever wrote about the Kennedy assassination, written by Pete Keese. And because he had a concept of what his responsibility was from his discipline as a reporter for the New York Times. As I said, he never even believed that there was a conspiracy, and he was a conservative guy in addition to that, but he believed that the discipline of a reporter required that the facts, whatever they were, be known. And there's still a few people like that around, and that's where we are at the present time. It's interesting to remember that a couple of things. It's often said that I was the first one to say that the CIA may have been involved, and that's not true. I was not the first one. So far as I know, the first person to do that, to raise the issue, was Robert Kennedy, who was on a plane when he was told that his brother had been assassinated, and he said, "Was it the CIA?" Didn't make the charge, but that was the first question that he asked. And then after 1 month after the assassination, see if I can find my, yeah, 1 month after the assassination, Harry Truman, who was the former president, this was not just 1 month later, it was from his office in Independent, Missouri, and it was to be published on December 22nd, 1963, 1 month to the day after the assassination. And of course, Truman was not an expert on the assassination. Nobody was at that time anyway. It was very early. But he insisted that this article that he wrote, he insisted that it be published in the Washington Post. Not the New York Times, but the Washington Post, because he wanted every member of Congress to have that on their desk when they came in, and because they all read the Washington Post. And this is what he said. This is a month after the assassination, a month to the day. I think it has become necessary to take another look at the purpose and operations of our Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Now, this is the guy who formed it, if you recall. Harry Truman is responsible for the organization of the CIA. This is what he wrote. That it became confusing with so many different intelligence groups out there feeding information to him. And so he wanted some group to go over this published material or unpublished material and synthesize it so he could get an understanding of what the intelligence organizations, because we had 1 million of them, intelligence organizations, including the CIA, but I mean, including all the other organizations, the DIA and the FBI, Secret Service, all of them, to bring it all together so that he could look at it. And he said that, this is what he said when he wrote about this just 1 month to the day after the assassination. I think it's become necessary to take another look at the purpose and operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. I decided to set up a special organization charged with the collection of all intelligence reports from every available source, and to have those reports reach me as president without department treatment or interpretations. Therefore, I decided to set up a special organization charged with the collection of all the intelligence reports from every available source, etc. I wanted and needed the information in its natural, raw state and in as comprehensive a volume as it was practical for me to make use of it. But the most important thing was that this move was to guard against the chance of intelligence being used to influence or lead the president into unwise decisions. And I thought it was necessary that the president do his own thinking and evaluating. Just wanted a group called the Central Intelligence Agency, pull all the material together and present it to him without an opinion. He would give us the opinion. He is the elected president. Then he said, for some time I've been disturbed by the way the CIA has been diverted from its original assignment. It has become an operational and at times a policy-making arm of the government. This has led to trouble and may have compounded our difficulties in several explosive areas. And then he said, I would therefore like to see the CIA be restored to its original assignment and that its operational duties be terminated or properly used elsewhere. There is something about the way the CIA has been functioning that is casting a shadow over our historic position, and I feel we need to correct it. 1 month to the day after the assassination, and I think it doesn't take a scholar to understand what it is he was telling us, which we never heard. I never saw a comment on this, never saw a radio or television station or a newspaper article talk about what President Truman, who set up the CIA, thought about the fact that it had become operational. And he was saying this just after the assassination of the president. So there are a lot of things to think about when we think about an organization which was set up to gather material, as the president who organized it said, and not to be operational. Is the CIA operational? It has its own Air Force now. We have 2 Air Forces. We used to have more. We used to have the Naval Air Force, the Army Air Force, etc. Then we ended up being the Air Force. And now it was that way for a long time. Now we have 2 Air Forces. The CIA has its own Air Force. There's a group. It's supposed to be not policy making and not operational. They got an Air Force, and they have bragged in the press that they have successfully fired more drones in the conflict in the Far East than has the United States Air Force. That's their competitor, the United States Air Force. So a group which was going to not be operational has its own Air Force, and nobody's commenting about that. And the guy who set it up said that even small operations that the CIA was engaged in were counter to its role and its function. So that's where we are now. What time is it? 15 minutes. 15 minutes, okay. So what do we do now? Well, I don't know. I think that's pretty much up to you guys out there to find a way to do something. I know some people talking about having a rally someplace at a march on Dealey Plaza, something like that. I mean, something like that would only be useful if it was an issue which really concerned masses of the American people. I don't think it is. I don't think that is true. In this case, we don't. You're all here, and I appreciate your being here. But the millions of Americans who think about this at all don't really have a plan, and don't have even much of a concern about trying to change all of this. That's up to us. Okay, I just want to, I'd like to take any questions anybody has, or comments. I can't hear you.
The story you just told about Truman, it's even better than what you said. He started writing that article 1 week after Kennedy's assassination. And after it was published, Allen Dulles, who was on the Warren Commission, flew in to Missouri and visited him. And he was very upset about the article. Okay? And he tried to get him to retract the article. Okay? He said, you know, this really wasn't us, it was really you. And Truman wouldn't retract it. But before he left, failing to get him to retract the article, he said something almost eerie. Remember the article you said about Arthur Kroc and Kennedy saying the CIA's... Before he left, Dulles turned to Truman and said, you know, President Kennedy denied all those stories about the CIA being out of control in Vietnam before he died. Okay? Clearly, he thought Truman wrote the article for that reason. Okay? All right, and this is in my book, and I can't take credit for it because your friend is the guy who got these documents. Ray Marcus, 80 years old, petitioned the Truman Library in Missouri to get the originating documents behind that original essay. Okay? He got this information, which I think was really, really important.
Yeah, because I know Ray Marcus. I haven't seen him in a million years, almost actually a million years, literally, but in a long time. And we formed the Citizens Commission of Inquiry, and I traveled around the country. We set up 200-300 different groups all around America, and Ray Marcus was very active in the one in Los Angeles, and then they took on a life of their own, and with that direction, which was the whole idea that they would each look into things and look into the matters, bring actions, do anything they should, and maybe let us know what they were doing, or if they didn't want to let us know, that's okay. And yeah, Ray Marcus is one of the best ones doing that.
You have a second question?
Yes.
So respecting, of course, your decision not to reveal names for the reasons that you expressed, and I understand that, would it be your opinion, however, that the CIA orchestrated and or carried out the assassination of President Kennedy?
Do I think the CIA was involved in doing that?
No, not involved.
What?
Carried out and orchestrated and carried out the assassination of President
Do I
Kennedy.
think that? Yes, of course I think that. And furthermore, it's important to understand that this was not a back alley killing where you can go out there someplace in the dark and shoot somebody and then it's unsolved because we don't know what happened. This man President Kennedy was surrounded by Secret Service agents. How did this take place? Well, first of all, the credentials for the Secret Service were prepared by the Central Intelligence Agency. This is not a suggestion. What I'm telling you is the facts. We have the documents. And, you know, it's amazing when you think that Secret Service is part of the Treasury Department. Can they print documents? They print all of our money. It's the largest printer in America, maybe in the world. But they couldn't print credentials themselves. It had to be done by the CIA. Well, the CIA did the Secret Service credentials and distributed them. That's why the CIA knew where every Secret Service agent was going to be that day. And the guy who came from behind the wooden fence and stopped by a police officer took out his Secret Service credentials, which were prepared for him and given to him by the Central Intelligence Agency. About that, there's no question. And so the role of the Secret Service is really interesting here, because the director of the Secret Service decided to take a vacation just before the assassination. You got to remember that Adlai Stevenson had been in Dallas and warned about how he was assaulted there, warned the president it's very, very dangerous to go to Dallas. Everybody knew this was a dangerous kind of operation. The head of the Secret Service in charge of that operation took a vacation. 11 other members of the White House detail resigned, not from the Secret Service, but from the White House detail. And we have all the names of the people who resigned. The highest role, the highest detail that you can have, if you remember the Secret Service, is the White House detail. I mean, people spend years, many years, in the Secret Service with that one goal. One day, I'll be on the White House detail. 11 of them withdrew. They stayed in the Secret Service, but they left the plum assignment just before, days before the assassination. And remember this, that the only Secret Service, what did the Secret Service do that day? Okay, thanks. The driver of the car, of the limousine, was a Secret Service agent. When the first sound was heard, it could have been a firecracker, it makes no difference. Any sound, his job was to step on the gas, take circuitous route, get out of there as fast as you can. He slowed down. How slow was he going? And the follow-up car was Clint Hill. And he's the only Secret Service agent who acted responsibly of all those there that day. Because in the right front passenger seat was a Secret Service agent. His job was to jump up and cover the president's body. He didn't even turn around. It was like he expected it. Only Clint Hill, who was assigned solely to protect Jacqueline Kennedy, and been traveling with her all around the world, wherever she went, he was there. Only Clint Hill, who was not part of the White House detail, he was assigned just to Jacqueline Kennedy. Only he acted. He jumped off the car, ran up and tried to catch the car, which he was able to do. Remember, he wasn't wearing running shoes, had leather soles, and he was able to catch the car after the shots were fired. The car was slowing down. Instead of speeding up, it was not taking evasive action. And the only person who took action appropriately of the Secret Service was Clint Hill, who actually apparently never got the memo, because he was not assigned to the Kennedy, to the security of John Kennedy, just for Jacqueline Kennedy. And he acted responsibly and heroically, and he also, without being the fastest runner in the world, was able to catch the car after the shots were fired. Of course, you can see there's a protofilm. You see the car slows down, but it's the proof of how slowly it was going was that even after the fatal shot was fired, even then, someone could go up and catch it. And it was sometime after that fatal shot was fired that then they picked up speed and got out of there quickly with the dead president in the back.
I'm John Judge with Coalition on Political Assassinations, and I'm glad you're going to be joining our annual conference in Dallas.
Where are you?
I'm right in front of you.
Oh. See the value of eyewitness testimony in cases?
Hidden in plain sight. I'm having a bit of a dispute with the mayor of Dallas because we hold an annual moment of silence that you've been part of in the past, up on the grassy knoll, and he's decided to take over Dealey Plaza this year and not allow any what he calls conspiracists or crazy conspiracy theory to be on the knoll. And
he has a 6th-floor museum.
Yes, 6th Floor Museum is part of the plotting of this, and also the Dallas rich are behind him and big Dallas money.
Let me tell you, outside of all of the other feelings I have about the 6th Floor Museum people who show no interest in anything which took place that day, is that they sell all the books on Kennedy assassination, hundreds of them. They sell them, except Rush to Judgment.
Yes, right. or anything critical, pretty much. I mean, but they hardly have any critical books when I've been in there. But in any case, I told him I got to have a meeting with the mayor at the inauguration and try to propose some alternatives, none of which he's taken. And but I said to him then when we were getting up, I said, because he's a public relations guy, 20 years with a big ad firm in Texas, and I said, if you want to, because he said there's a cathartic event, and they're going to cleanse Dallas of being the city of shame, the city of hate, and it's going to improve their reputation, and he's trying to capture the world press when they come. I said, if you really want to improve the reputation of Dallas, you're the mayor in a city that has a cold case standing. And I told him that Medgar Evers' wife was scheduled to speak at the inauguration, where they had opened a cold case. And I said, you could call for people to come forward who know anything. You could call for documents in Dallas to be released. And based on the evidence, you could call for a grand jury.
I'm sure he's really excited about your suggestion.
Oh, no, he was. He said, maybe we'll get to that later. Yeah. But,
maybe the 100th anniversary would be a good time
That's
to
right,
check
I
it out.
think so. But I'm just bringing this up because you talked about France restoring their reputation by, finally saying that Dreyfus was innocent. And if they really wanted to restore the reputation of Dallas, that would do it with the world press and the national press. But I'm wondering what you think about having a grand jury in Texas or elsewhere try to address this.
Well, I tried everything, as I said, trying to get the Congress to become a grand jury. And they tried, they did some stuff, and as we know, they uncovered some information. A grand jury could do this. I think you could show any federal grand jury can just say it was the president, and the murder has no statute of limitations, so it could be done, but it takes the will of someone who wants to do that. And I don't, the will of someone in authority who wants to do that, and I don't think that we see a lot of that taking place now, evidenced.
I'm afraid we're out of time for questions. I'm sure you're going to be around all day, right, Mark?
Yes.
So please catch up with Mark as you can. Thank you so much for coming, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Before we move on, someone left a pair of glasses yesterday. They appear to be a woman's glasses, maybe not. Silver frame. I'll just leave them up here on this table if you're looking for a pair of glasses. They're not yours. No, you got yours. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, moving on. As I mentioned earlier, and as you guys know as well as me, there's been exactly one criminal trial of a defendant charged with conspiracy in the murder of President Kennedy, and that, of course, was the trial of Clay Shaw by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, who was famously, or some would say infamously, depicted by Kevin Costner in Oliver Stone's movie JFK. 10 years ago, when we were planning our 40th anniversary conference, I was contacted by Professor Joan Mellen. I was immediately intrigued because she's a professor of English and creative writing at Temple University, and I'm a recovering English major myself, and I was interested in the fact that someone from that background was so deeply immersed in issues of American politics. And Joan is the author of multiple books, including what I think is the quintessential book on the Garrison case. And she has since written a number of other books, a book on George de Mohrenschildt, a book on Cuba. She's got another book coming out shortly. I don't know how she does all this writing, but we're very pleased to have Joan Mellen.
It's an honor to follow Mark Lane, and to honor Mark Lane for the courage that he has shown for his whole life and not being afraid to talk about CIA and its role in the Kennedy assassination. I published my book about Jim Garrison, and it's a pleasure to talk to you about Jim Garrison. I published my book, it's called A Farewell to Justice, in 2005. And last month, I reissued the book with a long update, and I put Perry Russo on the cover. And people have been, whoa, Perry Russo, because CIA had attempted to discredit Jim Garrison from 1965 until today, and that's maybe more than 20 years after his death. And I was very pleased to hear Lisa Pease, where's Lisa? Did I just see Lisa? Talk about Jim Phelan last night and his efforts to discredit Perry Russo prior to the trial of Clay Shaw. And also Walter Sheridan, of course, led that operation against Russo and Jim Garrison. So here we are, and here's Perry Russo and Jim Garrison. I'd also like to mention something about Dr. Robert McClelland, to whom I interviewed for A Farewell to Justice, and it appears in the book. And I want to tell you that of all the doctors at Parkland Hospital, Dr. McClelland was so reticent that he never put himself forward, he never sought notoriety. And I had to track him down, and I had to find a friend of his niece, and his niece had to call him before he was willing to talk about the Kennedy assassination. So it was quite wonderful to see him on the screen here. And very important in this 50th year to credit the correct people who are willing to speak out and tell the truth about what happened to President Kennedy. I'd also like now to talk about Garrison. For the people who are too young and might not have read the book, or I'm going to talk a little bit about things that some people already know about the Garrison case. And also, but the update in particular talks about information that I found about Garrison in the case after the book came out up to today. And Dr. Aguilar, I guess isn't here yet, but he was going to make a slide of the document that I found that showed unequivocally that Clay Shaw was a paid contract source for CIA, because so many people have said, oh no, he was just debriefed by the Domestic Contact Service, and just as thousands of businessmen were debriefed, and it wasn't true. He was paid, and the phrase is highly paid. In fact, Ben Weck did a wonderful thing. He put that document in your program. So if you look at page, I think, 38 to 43, you will see our favorite document, nicknamed Highly Paid. Among the curiosities at the National Archives are two brimming, and I want to talk a lot about the Office of Security. We talk often about the clandestine services, but there's another component that has played a major role in covering up the assassination and involving itself with people involved in the assassination. That was the agency's Office of Security. And I found out only recently that in every city that had a field office for CIA, the Office of Security had its own office from which they maneuvered whatever they were going to do. And in particular in New Orleans, they were watching Jim Garrison and sending out assets from that office. It wasn't only, and in New Orleans, you probably know, the field office handled both the domestic contact service and also the operations, the clandestine services. It came out of one office. All right, among the curiosities at the National Archives are 2 brimming Office of Security files of documents and clippings dating from 1967, the time of the Garrison investigation. These materials are all about Garrison's prosecution of Clay Shaw. Yet the file jackets read, not Jim Garrison, Garrison case, or Clay Shaw. Rather, they're marked George de Mohrenschildt. And for CIA, these figures served similar functions. The Great Game in Cuba, that's my book about Cuba. You'll find it a little odd maybe, but my main point that the Great Game is a British locution that refers to the intelligence services. So that's what the Great Game was. That book examines CIA's handling of the anti-Castro efforts. Following Jim Garrison's hypothesis that CIA had something to do with the Kennedy assassination, it examines the politics of the agency right before and after the Kennedy assassination. President Kennedy was furious to discover that CIA was making policy, and Mark Lane alluded to that. I attempted to uncover the agency's political perspective, what policies they supported. And the other book that Ben just mentioned is a book about Mac Wallace, a Texan who was accused of being a serial killer and hitman in the pay of Lyndon Johnson. So I redid that investigation. Yeah, I'm tired, I guess. Every author who writes about the subject of the Kennedy assassination draws on the profusion of documents in the archives, myself included. Although most writers rarely tip their hats to Jim Garrison in gratitude. I used the word gratitude last night to Oliver Stone. They should. If it weren't for Garrison, there would have been no Oliver Stone and no movie JFK. And if there were no movie JFK, there would have been no John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. And if there were no such act, none of the books that have been printed in the last 20 years could have been written. So we're grateful to Oliver Stone, but also to Jim Garrison, who's behind that whole effort. Okay. When a grand jury indicted Clay Shaw, based significantly on the testimony of Garrison witness Perry Raymond Russo, it was, Garrison said, the first blow struck to the Warren Report. Garrison was the first person to make public the Zapruder film at the Shaw trial. The prosecution showed the film several times. In response to objections from Clay Shaw's lawyers, Judge Haggerty ruled that Garrison could show the Zapruder film as many times as he wanted to. So it was Garrison who first made the point, and in a court of law, that Lee Harvey Oswald, whatever he was, could not have been the lone assassin that the Warren Commission depicted him as being. At this moment, when we are facing less openness from government than ever before, less transparency, despite Barack Obama's promises, and less respect for history, as we are passing the torch to a new generation of researchers, it seems appropriate to remember what this field owes to Jim Garrison. Over the past decade, I might add, we have witnessed a profusion of books characterized by, I think, sloppy research, errors, and they're passed down from one book to another in their effort to insist that Lyndon Johnson and or his lawyer in Texas, Cliff Carter, or his factotum rather, Cliff Carter, was alone responsible for the Kennedy assassination. They ignore the Garrison findings as if they didn't exist. Not a single one refers either to Garrison or to the intelligence community involvement It almost looks as if it's a plot, doesn't it? It looks like a conspiracy. All these books that are talking about Johnson as the mastermind, not one, you think they would have to mention Garrison, because Oswald was in New Orleans during the summer of 1963 and so forth. They never do. They insist that the assassination was the expression of what they call Texas justice. Allow me to add that had Jim Garrison not reached some dead ends, and by the way, I loved what Oliver Stone said last night, because he was not ashamed of Jim Garrison. He didn't apologize for Jim Garrison. And there's no need to do so at all. Had some of Garrison's insights not gone nowhere, he would not have been an honest investigator. A startling example was Garrison's charging of Edgar Eugene Bradley, and Garrison, which I wrote long ago, apologized to Bradley, who forgave him, as Bradley told me. As Robert J. Clayburgh, Jr., who was the head of King Ranch in Texas, says in my book, The Great Game in Cuba, the road to progress is paved with mistakes. The significance of the Garrison investigation does not reside in Jim Garrison's having always been right. There is one way to remedy the injustice of history written without scholarly standards. That is, for those beginning the research today, if they are, to whom we are passing the torch, to arm themselves with at least some of the disciplines that alone will liberate them from such pseudo-research as that emanating from Texas. Go to law school. Go to medical school. Use Dr. Cyril Wecht as your ideal and paradigm, and do both. Other figures here, like Walt Brown, who will be speaking tomorrow, has a PhD in history and several master's degrees. Join law enforcement, as Walt did. Spend some time examining its methodology. Then comes the task of interpreting the evidence once you recognize it. Consider whether the person you are interviewing is speaking against his own interest, as was Thomas Edward Beckham, behind whose testimony I'm standing, and I added new information in the update. And note that Dr. McClellan, too, did not seek to have his name in the funny papers. And here, I'd like to this is a slight digression perhaps, I'd like to talk to you about my interviews with FBI agent Warren DeBruys. Mr. DeBruys is famous, I guess it's for creating Commission Document 75, if that's correct, and a huge document that was dated December 2nd, 1963. Not surprisingly, in our interviews, Mr. DeBruys did not contradict the testimony he gave before several government bodies. He did not know Oswald. He never met Oswald, he said. I asked him whether he was the person who sent Oswald to Carlos Bringier's store, Carlos Bringier being the Cuban with whom Oswald had an altercation on Canal Street. And that was what Bringier had told me. He had said to me in our interview, Warren DeBruys had come to his store and said, I can infiltrate you anytime. And 2 or 3 days later, Oswald appears at his door. So I asked Mr. DeBruys, did you send Oswald to Carlos Bringier's store? Never ask a question where you don't already know the answer. We know that, right? Mr. DeBruys smiled. He did not deny that he had sent Oswald to Bringier's store. He just said, that's far-fetched. Wish we could use that. Mr. DeBruys preferred not to lie outright. I take that as a compliment and a courtesy when it wasn't necessary. Then, just before my book went to press, originally, I called him and asked whether he had anything he wanted to add. A person would not be very intelligent after all this time he didn't change his mind, Mr. DeBruys said. This was a wink to me for all my trouble. It is not evidence. In the 8 years since the publication of A Farewell to Justice, monitoring as best I could the releases that were still issuing from the agencies, and with Freedom of Information inquiries, let me say right now that everything that has come to my attention only confirms the validity of Jim Garrison's certainty that there was an intelligence component both to the murder of President Kennedy and in the cover-up of what happened after the assassination. For those not familiar with the Garrison investigation, the most controversial choice Jim Garrison made, and the one that led to a CIA harassment that has continued to this day was to arrest Clay Shaw, the director of the International Trade Mart, for participation in a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. When I mentioned that I was working on a book about Garrison to the late New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis at a conference at NYU on the subject of 9/11, Lewis literally turned white. I have to. Garrison could place Shaw with a Leon Oswald in two venues. One was a party at the apartment of David Ferry. Garrison's source was Perry Russo, whom I mentioned earlier, and whose testimony was challenged then and later. A significant participant in the fierce effort to discredit Russo was Walter Sheridan, who could boast of having worked for NSA, CIA, FBI, and God knows who else. He was also Robert Kennedy's right-hand man. When Jim Garrison charged Sheridan, Robert Kennedy came to his aid. There was no law against obstruction of justice in Louisiana at the time. Garrison had to come up with other charges against Sheridan. I found a friend of David Ferry's named John Wilson, someone Garrison never interviewed, and who had seen Oswald both handing out the leaflets for Fair Play for Cuba on Canal Street and at Ferry's apartment. Wilson wasn't present on the evening when Clay Shaw stated what his alibi would be on the day of the assassination, but for me, that Wilson placed Oswald at Ferry's apartment went some way to enhancing Russo's credibility. John Wilson lives in Arizona, if anyone wants to continue this. In addition to Russo's testimony, the other evidence that Garrison had relied upon was the appearance of Clay Shaw, along with Oswald and David Ferry in Clinton, Louisiana, and Jackson, Louisiana. One of Shaw's lawyers, Salvador Panzeca, told me, quote, Clinton never happened. Well, HSCA, and I'm sure Mr. Tannenbaum knows that. He had to have known otherwise. And I think the lie reveals the desperation of the Shaw defense. They thought that he was going to be convicted. The testimony of the Clinton witnesses at the Shaw trial, testifying that they saw Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald together up there, alone provides the overt act that should have convicted Clay Shaw of participation in a conspiracy involving Oswald. It did not depend upon whether Oswald actually killed President Kennedy, and Jim Garrison thought that Oswald never even fired a shot. So devastating was the testimony of the Clinton witnesses, African American and white, that when almost a decade later the House Select Committee on Assassination sent Patricia Orr, one of its staff, up to Clinton and Jackson, she was given strict instructions not to interview anyone up there who had not been interviewed by Jim Garrison. The Clinton evidence was to be contained. This eliminated a major witness, Dr. Frank Silva, who the medical director of the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson, where Oswald was sent to apply for a job. This, Oswald learned when he got up there, was a mental hospital. After the trial of Clay Shaw, where he was acquitted, as we know, jurors expressed their bewilderment as to motive. Respectable socialite Clay Shaw, it strained credulity as to why he would become involved in the murder of the president. Jim Garrison believed that Shaw was acting as Oswald's shepherd in New Orleans under instructions from CIA. But he couldn't prove it, certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt. At that time, in the late 1960s, few knew how CIA was configured. You notice I'm not using the definite article in keeping with agency practice. They never say the CIA, they just say CIA. All right. Just a second. I devoted a long section of the new edition of A Farewell to Justice to anatomizing just a portion of how CIA works from its own documents. The Garrison investigation asks us to turn our attention to CIA and how it figures in the configuration of U.S. power then and now. I note that the DDP, the clandestine services as they were then known, the letters stand for Deputy Director for Plans, a euphemism, at the time presided over 15 separate components. The DDI, Directorate for Intelligence, and the DDP operated entirely independently of each other. Some of the funds destined for clandestine operations were non-vouchered. If you were of career status, of course, you were paid on the books. I don't know what that tells us about the Clay Shaw highly paid. Another world within the world to borrow from Don DeLillo's great novel, Libra, was the security research staff of the Office of Security, which shared information with only one other component, CI/SIG, Counterintelligence Special Investigation Group. They had so many names for what they were doing. The Office of Security and its SRS, Security Research Staff, headed by General Paul Gaynor and his deputy Bruce Soley, was the only component to share information with James Angleton's counterintelligence. It is instructive to look into how CIA avoided compliance with the Church Committee's requests on the Kennedy assassination. One handwritten sheet that I had issued from Bruce Soley at the Security Research Staff of the Office of Security. It refers to, quote, sensitive documents which were pulled from OS files prior to their being reviewed by Frank Church's Senate Select Committee. There were two figures about whom CIA was worried and decided to protect. One was marked Oswald file and contained documents dating from April 1959, prior to Oswald's departure for the Soviet Union, a period for which CIA insisted it had no knowledge of Oswald. The other file CIA concealed from the Church Committee had to do with Jack Martin, who figured prominently in Jack Martin was the person who on the weekend of the assassination knocked on the door of the district attorney's office in New Orleans and said, you know, Oswald knew David Ferry. Just want to tell you that. And so that the Garrison's office immediately went to try to find David Ferry on the Sunday after the assassination. The Office of Security revealed it had denied the Church Committee 4 sets of records from its Volume 6. These files referred to a man named Jack Martin, or John G. Martin, or Joseph James Martin. So many Jack Martins. What is this? Of all the people CIA felt it necessary to shield, they chose these two. They didn't choose Ferry, by the way. They didn't choose Clay Shaw. We see the same CIA protection of Jack Martin in documents included in Russ Holmes' Clay Shaw file. There are pages listing the names of people associated, quote, directly or indirectly, this is CIA's language, with Shaw. Each of the names was then subjected to a name trace through CIA's, quote, Records Integration Division, RID. The only name that would not be subjected to a trace was Jack Martin. Another CIA document refers to the agency's use of the name Jack Martin, and they use, this is the CIA's word, generic, as a generic. As Louisiana House Select Committee investigator L.J. Delsa, a former New Orleans homicide officer, explained to me, this was so you could never be certain you were dealing with the correct Jack Martin. CIA need not fear that its relationship with the New Orleans Jack would become known. Delsa concluded that Jack Martin was, quote, hardcore CIA. It was Jack Martin, as I said, who first informed Garrison's office. It was Jack Martin who functioned in New Orleans as the handler of a man named Thomas Edward Beckham, who became known to the House Committee on Assassinations. And in fact, Delsa and Burris's interviews with Beckham led directly to their being suspended and their quitting, and refusing to be part of the New Orleans team, the Louisiana team, for the House. None of the documents originating with CIA, by the way, were available to Jim Garrison during his investigation. I would urge future researchers to re-examine Jack Martin and investigate some of his assertions. Among them was that Bobby Kennedy's right-hand man, Walter Sheridan, functioned, quote, as a hatchet man, and I'm not saying I know that this is true, but Jack Martin said this, for Kim Philby, the MI6 agent who penetrated high CIA circles before he vanished behind the Iron Curtain. As many here know, the prosecution did not raise the issue of Clay Shaw's relationship with CIA at the Shaw trial. It was Shaw's lawyer, Irvin Diamond, who asked Shaw, have you ever worked for the Central Intelligence Agency? Shaw replied, no, I have not. As recently as last May, a writer self-published a biography of Clay Shaw in which he repeats that CIA utilized Shaw only for debriefings as a source of no greater importance than many others. And now comes the CIA document dated 1992 that tells that different story. This document, issuing from CIA's History Review staff, or Historical Review Group, among its project files, and this group no longer exists. CIA has decided no more internal histories for us, not even those that would not be, because it's possible they'll be released, and they don't want that. This document at once demolishes the defenders of Clay Shaw. Of course, it begins with a disclaimer, the document does. Nothing was found in the CIA records, CIA writes, that, quote, indicates any CIA role in the Kennedy assassination or assassination conspiracy, if there was one, or any CIA involvement with Oswald. CIA's history staff chief, J. Kenneth MacDonald, then continues with the dropping line. These records do reveal, however, that Clay Shaw was a highly paid CIA contract source until 1956. The key words are highly paid and contract. Shaw may not have been a 9-to-5, quote, employee, but he certainly enjoyed a complex relationship with the agency. The 1956 end date should not confuse us. As I showed in A Farewell to Justice, William Gaudet, a CIA asset who was housed at Shaw's International Trade Mart in New Orleans, noted that the end dates CIA gave to his service were always inaccurate. And in effect, there was no end date at all, Gaudet said. And I found also in the document I mentioned last night, it's the Brown and Root document that was issued under the JFK Act, and discusses all the CIA connections of Herman and George Brown, the founders of, well, Herman was the founder of Brown and Root, and all the executives of Brown and Root are listed, maybe 9 or 10 of them. The end date for Herman's CIA relationship was listed as 1966. Herman died in 1962. So these end dates are irrelevant, really. And I'd like to mention, too, that several things. One is that historians, particularly CIA historians, who were the people who were dealing with those project files, would not put this fact in print unless some document existed confirming Shaw's CIA status. We don't have it, but we can rest assured. More, this was an internal CIA document, part of CIA's project files, administrative records never meant for release. It is evidence against interest, since CIA stated in other places that they had nothing to do with Shaw except for routine debriefings, and nothing, of course, to do with the Kennedy assassination. When Jim Garrison read the December 1967 issue of Ramparts magazine, which featured a story called Building Lyndon Johnson. That's a pun, right? Because the builders were Herman and George Brown, and they were the supporters of Lyndon Johnson and made his political career, Brown and Root. He drew a line, Garrison then drew a line between Oswald, CIA, George Brown, and Lyndon Johnson. It was Garrison's questions and his daring to invoke the name George Brown as a sacred name. And because you know that Brown and Root functioned as part of the U.S. military. This is not just a construction company. This led CIA to release the document. I number these releases, there was a sizable file of them, as among the achievements of Jim Garrison. Many of these documents bear the subject line, possible attempt to embarrass agency. They expose once more how far CIA had moved from being, as Mark Lane had just told you, being the intelligence gathering service it had long pretended to be. By the way, it's George Kennan, isn't it, who wrote that document for the Security Council -10/2 that gave CIA the power to embezzle, to murder, to assassinate, and all of that. And that document was issued, George Kennan wrote it, of course, with Alan Dulles leaning over his shoulder, even after Project Gladio was enforced in Italy. That's another story. These documents illuminate how CIA was connected to the country's defense contractors, a penetration that began in the 1950s with CIA operations in Syria. There are 100 CIA people in Syria today. So this, we're turning round and round, on behalf, the one in the 1950s was on behalf of Bechtel. Bechtel wanted a new pipeline. That government of Syria said, no, they don't want to give Bechtel the new pipeline, and so the CIA obliged and overthrew that government, and Bechtel got its pipeline. And of course, we know about Iran and CIA's overthrow of Mossadegh. Garrison's work unlocked doors previously closed to history. He could not have known that records would be released under a JFK Act. These records, peripheral to the assassination, as I said, widen the scope of what we know about the role of the intelligence services in the power structure of the United States. These records also reveal how defense contractors like Brown and Root functioned as members of the U.S. military in a symbiotic relationship. By now, much of this, I hope, has become common knowledge, but it was not so in Jim Garrison's time. Jim Garrison was so despised by CIA because in the course of his investigation, he was moving ever closer to a more realistic view of how power worked in America, a discovery inspired by President Kennedy's own warfare with CIA. Had Jim Garrison had access to the documents stating that Clay Shaw was, quote, a highly paid CIA contract source, he could have convicted Shaw on perjury on the spot. CIA's admission of Shaw's employment goes a long way to clarifying why Shaw should have been traversing the rural Louisiana countryside north of Baton Rouge in the company of a man half his age who possessed neither the education, social connections, nor savoir-faire Shaw would have preferred in an acquaintance. He was not befriending Lee Oswald based on his own choice or preference, or because Oswald was a potential sexual partner. Clay Shaw was on assignment. I refer to a scene in the earlier version of A Farewell to Justice, when Shaw answered a call from Garrison's assistant, Richard Burns, who asked for a John. He calls up and says, "Is John Shaw there?" And Shaw says, "Who sent you?" Which is not the usual reply that you would give. And there is considerable evidence that Clay Shaw was serving CIA. And of course, we have the famous quote given to us by Victor Marchetti, where Helms turns to Thomas Karamisonis and says, "Are we doing enough for that guy down there?" Another CIA document released in 2003 and dated June 28, 1978, describes Clay Shaw's services to CIA as running from 1949 through 1972, which is more realistic. Shaw died in August 1974. It indicates that Shaw was serving the SAG Security Analysis Group of the Office of Security. So now we have Shaw files from at least 3 CIA components: the Clandestine Services, the Office of Security, and Domestic Contact Service. The Office of Security, as I said, okay, I told you that. This 1978 document confirms that Clay Shaw's CIA contact in New Orleans was Hunter Leak, which is also something confirmed by historian Michael Kurtz. And so one day, a source of mine, whose name was Judge John Rarick, who was one of the major racists in the state of Louisiana, but was a classmate of Jim Garrison's at Tulane. And Judge Rarick was helping me, and even interviewing some of the people there. The locals would never talk to me, a New York intellectual, a Jew. And it was inconceivable. So I told John Rarick the questions, and he asked John Manchester, the deputy of, I can't remember, what was he, deputy sheriff or whatever down there, the marshal, town marshal. Leak's son, Rob, has talked about, then he met John Rarick at one of these, like the Lions Club or one of these meetings, and he told John Rarick his father had given so many reminiscences of his relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald. And so I called Rob Leak, and I tried to get him to tell them to me, but he just wouldn't say a word. Nothing. Jim Garrison was certain of Oswald's intelligence connections. It remains difficult even now, 44 years after the Shaw trial, to really pin these down. And I told Rex, yesterday, we're waiting for the church committee testimonies of the people from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, like Wendell Roche, who said when the church committee contacted him, "I'm waiting 12 years to tell somebody about Oswald." So we only have the summary of Wendell Roche's testimony to the church committee. We still don't have the testimony. And I heard yesterday that he's decided not to say anything anymore, or he decided later not to. But we would love to see that testimony. I try to clarify Oswald's intelligence connections by suggesting that he was debriefed by the Soviet Russia component, SR-6's Eleanor Reed, who used the pseudo Anderson. Anderson was a great pseudo for Eleanor Reed because there were so many Andersons working for CIA, just like the Jack Martin story. SR-6 was the Soviet realities branch and focused on the details of everyday life in the Soviet Union. We do have the declassified documents of Reed's debriefing of Robert Webster, a fellow false defector. The language of Eleanor Reed's reports of those debriefings of Webster bear a remarkable resemblance to the Warren Commission's language in the descriptions of its lone assassin. Webster is described as, quote, a self-centered and shallow person who is unequipped to handle the stresses of everyday living. Tension and time tend to overwhelm him. Reed concludes that Webster is a sociopath. Doesn't the Warren report say sociopath? Jim Garrison observed that not only was Oswald never alone during his time in New Orleans, but he was never with anyone who was not with CIA. This sounds like hyperbole, but it isn't. It's worth referencing a CIA cover and routing sheet dated May 31st, 1960. It issues from the Oswald 201 file, 289248, and indicates that CIA's Counterintelligence Division was well aware of Oswald many months before December 1960, when it had acknowledged that it had opened an Oswald file. This document references the initials JP, suggesting Jerry Prehn, P-R-E-H-N, an agency employee at the time. CIA dates Prehn's service as beginning in 1963, for what it's worth. The routing sheet was released also by CIA's Historical Review Program. JP is the fifth person to whom this document was routed, and he was its SR-9, the very powerful operations component of the Soviet Russia division, just to give us an idea of what we're up against. When I telephoned Mr. Prehn in 2012, he was 80 years old. He did not deny that he had been with CIA at the time. He did deny that he was the JP on the document. He did not deny that SR-9, the operations branch of the Soviet Russia division, had knowledge of Oswald in 1960. A supposedly disgruntled former Marine and hapless defector, Oswald has his files shuffling up and down various components within CIA. Information about Oswald crossed the desks of those attached to the most sensitive part of the Soviet Russia division, years later, at the last minute, CIA's Office of Information Management finally revealed to the ARRB that there was indeed an Office of Security file on Oswald. Unfortunately, when the 7-volume set arrived at the ARRB, Volume 5 was missing. CIA twisted itself into a pretzel trying to explain the missing volume, including in one explanation that, quote, it may never have existed, and it was absent due to faulty numbering. This file resided in the security office of CIA and remained there until someone in the ARRB discovered HSCA documents which detailed the fact that HSCA had access to Oswald's security office file. I want to say something in dissent to yesterday morning's tongue, because whether or not that dictabelt was challenged, and it had been challenged 20 years ago. It's no news that the dictabelt was challenged. That does not discount the enormous contribution that HSCA and also the Church Committee made to the study of the Kennedy assassination. And the implication that because the dictabelt was valid or not valid, that somehow the conclusion of HSCA, as Mark Lane said, that there was a conspiracy, is somehow undermined. Don't be misled by that. That whole talk about the dictabelt was a means of discrediting HSCA, and with it, the conclusion of conspiracy. We know better. We know that there's an enormous evidence of conspiracy. Came from the Garrison investigation, came from HSCA, came from all the lies that top CIA officers told to the Church Committee. One of them was James Angleton. He sat there and he denied that Oswald was ever debriefed. No, never. It had to be the military. Of course, we know that CIA debriefed Oswald. And there were many other lies by Lawrence Houston and other very, very top CIA officers. All right. I also discussed in the new update the fact that, and I'm sure many people know this, that a CIA employee named Donald Dencelia had seen a document come from the radio factory in Minsk from a person unnamed. And of course, who could that be? How many American CIA people were in the radio factory in Minsk? Only one. CIA releases. I want to just talk a few minutes about Fred Lee Chrisman now. CIA releases allow us to connect Thomas Edward Beckham's handler, Fred Lee Chrisman, with Clay Shaw, the Louisiana investigators for HSCA, L.J. Delsa and Robert Burris, were forbidden to investigate. I guess it was Gary Cornwell, who shall we name somebody that did it, to investigate a figure in whom Garrison was interested, named Fred Lee Chrisman. And Burris said to me recently, I hate to think about those days because we had no chance. It was a corrupted investigation at HSCA. It was heavily controlled by CIA, by someone called Scott Breckenridge, who was assigned to do that job, and he sat there and looked over not only the final reports, but the questions. And Gaten Fonzie, whose wife is here today, Marie, told me, as he was sitting there listening to the questioning of Bernardo de Torres, Gaten said, to think of all the hundreds of thousands of Cubans, you would never know that why, you would never know why, of all the hundreds of thousands of Cubans in Miami, they chose this one to depose. And CIA had come in the morning to control what questions the HSCA asked de Torres, and then the FBI came in with another time period. They were not to ask him any questions about that. If anybody wants to do the investigation further, Bernardo de Torres walks around in Miami. You can find him at Publix supermarket, and he's been spotted. Garrison remained interested in Fred Lee Chrisman after a farewell to justice was, remained interested in Chrisman. After a farewell to justice was published, the distinguished Freedom of Information lawyer Daniel Alcorn, sitting over there in the front row, wonderful figure, and he'll be chairing a panel this afternoon, please attend. He requested of CIA on my behalf what they had on Jack Martin and Fred Lee Chrisman. It was said that the first person Clay Shaw telephoned after he was arrested by Jim Garrison was Fred Lee Chrisman. Reason enough for further inquiry into the character of Chrisman. Dan Alcorn requested, quote, all records related to Jack S. Martin and name variations and aliases provided. Joseph James Martin and Fred Lee Chrisman, who was an acquaintance of Martin. Alcorn told CIA that Thomas Edward Beckham had claimed that Martin and Chrisman were his CIA handlers. Alcorn included for CIA's central cover staff records that reflected 3 CIA-connected Jack Martins, and he listed their agency identification numbers, AIN, I guess, which we had from the National Archives. All intelligence people are good con men, L.J. Delsa remarked to me. That we are associating con men like Beckham and Chrisman with CIA could not surprise anyone in law enforcement. CIA sent a medium-sized file in response to Alcorn's FOIA request. I call your attention to one official routing slip dated February 16, 1970, contained in this file. It suggests that the Soviet Russia Division's counterintelligence component, Lieutenant Bagley, that is, and his book is coming out in November, had set up at least one file on Fred Lee Chrisman. He was hardly a stranger to the agency. Many of the documents were already available in the National Archives. There was one document that I had not seen. Others might have seen it. I hadn't, although it had been approved for release in 1993. It is stamped CIA Historical Review Program, which we know about, and a 2-page single-spaced letter to a Mrs. Banfield from a writer who is an agency employee but prefers not to sign his name. The letter is dated September 13, 1969, the year of the Shaw trial. Shaw was already acquitted. Some have said it is a forgery. I don't see why. It's interesting to me because it demonstrates that Jim Garrison was on the right track in zeroing in on Beckham and Chrisman. The letter to Mrs. Banfield comes with an official routing slip on which the author has written, OP's set up file on Fred Lee Chrisman, send file to me. Apparently Mrs. Banfield has requested a trace on Chrisman. The author has had difficulty in accessing the appropriate files. This man, Chrisman, the author writes, is a man that is dangerous to the future of America. He terms Chrisman a, quote, disruption agent. The writer of the letter suggests there was disagreement within the agency regarding assignments tendered to operatives domestically. They said they didn't operate domestically. They operated domestically from day one. You look at the Frank Wisner file. CIA never obeyed that stricture of its charter. The author says of Chrisman, he represents no one but a section of the CIA. In response to the Garrison investigation, CIA issued a denial that Chrisman was one of their own, a disclaimer we take with a grain of salt. This disclaimer came from Howard J. Osborne, then the director of the Office of Security. Where else? Contradicting itself, knowing there would be no accountability, and Mark Lane made that point this morning, CIA included in the FOIA release a document referring to, quote, copies of DCD information pertaining to F. Lee Chrisman, referring to activities during 1966 to 1968. Another document offers a list of 10 agency-connected people that includes, with Chrisman, known CIA contract personnel, people like Frank Bartes and Lawrence Laborde, whom I discuss in the Cuba book. By the way, in the Cuba book, I discussed Laborde, whom Garrison tried to subpoena as having a monthly CIA salary. A person who contacted me after the publication of A Farewell to Justice was an Alabama judge named Charles McKnight, recently retired. Do I have more, where's Ben? Do I have more time, or should I? Should I finish? I'll finish. You can always ask me questions later.
Depends on whether you want to take questions. You have 15 minutes.
How much do I have? There's so much that I found out even since the publication of the book. Well, I'm a little bit more, and then we'll have questions. Okay. McKnight had represented Thomas Edward Beckham on a wire fraud charge regarding concert. He was a con man, there's no doubt about that. Concert proceeds not paid. At the time, McKnight had just completed a clerkship with a federal judge and was practicing law. He decided to check out everything Beckham told him. Everything checked out. Thomas Edward Beckham told McKnight something he didn't tell me during our interviews. He had been in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, and he had seen Oswald there. A year after McKnight represented Oswald, his office was what he called sanitized, and Beckham's file was taken. Judge McKnight involved the FBI to help him. He liked Beckham. He involved the FBI to track down Beckham. The agent said this, "Let me tell you something, he doesn't exist." Shortly after that, Beckham sent McKnight the gift of a chess set. I mention all this to suggest that the Garrison investigation bears further study as we pass the torch. The Clinton-Jackson visit by Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Lee Harvey Oswald all suggests further opportunities for research. When I was in Clinton last, after the book was published, I was told that Oswald's girlfriend, whose name was Gloria Wilson, not another name that you might have heard, whose name appears in Garrison's files, had been murdered. A local resident named Hadley Hudnall knew that Oswald had sometimes stayed with Gloria on St. Helena Street, 3 blocks from Clinton Courthouse, where we were talking. What do I want to do? I heard from Al Crouch, who owned Saturn Aviation and who had fired David Ferry. When Crouch received calls from both the FBI and CIA, he knew enough to put David Ferry's logbooks in a floor safe. Indeed, the logbooks survived the break-in. After that, Crouch contacted Garrison's office. Here, luck intervenes, bad luck. Crouch reached the traitorous William Gurvich, who you might name you know, or perhaps his brother Leonard, whose daughter perished in Jonestown, because both of them arrived at Crouch's office. The Gurviches told me they worked for Jim Garrison and he needed the logbooks turned over to them. Crouch believed they would go to Jim Garrison, and of course, they were never seen again. And then Crouch received an anonymous telephone call. "You have my logbooks," the caller said. Then the person added, "Do you have a little girl about 3 years old who rides a bicycle?" That's why we haven't heard from Crouch. After that, Crouch kept silent. "I felt like a dead man," he said. Such were the obstacles Jim Garrison faced, and he faced trouble even after his death. I have to tell you some of this. Judge Dennis A. Barry, who had been Garrison's law partner before he became a district attorney. Judge Dennis A. Barry had served the district attorney's office for a time. He told me a major personality from a major news organization had telephoned Orleans Parish Coroner Frank Minyard, whose picture you might have seen because he identified many of the corpses from Hurricane Katrina, and offered him money to say that the autopsy of Jim Garrison revealed that he had died of AIDS. And so I was desperate to get that death certificate in my hands from Minyard. He wouldn't give it to me. I said, "I'm entitled to it. It's a public document." "Oh yes, you sue me and then I'll appeal." That was, but he told me the cause of death, and the cause of death of Jim Garrison was a blood poisoning, septicemia, caused by unhealed bed sores. He'd been in bed for a year. And if you don't deal with those bed sores, it seeps into the bloodstream, and that was what. And Mignard said he insisted on doing an autopsy despite the objections of the Garrison family, because precisely he knew that the issue of what Garrison died of would come up. Ben says 10 minutes. Would you like to have questions? Maybe questions. Is that good? I have so much, but I can't do it all. This gentleman over here. Oh, sorry.
I want to make 2 comments about questions real quickly. They should be questions, not speeches, okay? Number 1. Number 2, from here on, I'm going to give priority to non-speakers. Nothing against our wonderful speakers, but you guys have microphone time of your own, so I'm going to focus on attendees. So we got one here.
Hello. In regard to all of the CIA characters, and I've heard nothing about Howard Hunt.
He didn't figure in the Garrison investigation.
Correct.
I'm not saying he was innocent or of anything or whatever, but I was a little skeptical about Howard Hunt's deathbed confession, because he put together people who in the agency would never have even talked to each other. The agency had strict protocols, and it was just like Clinton and Jackson, Louisiana. The African-American people and the white people did not speak to each other. They didn't even walk on the same side of the street, so they could not have created a conspiracy saying that Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald were up there as a planned fantasy, because they never spoke, and we had black and white witnesses there. So the same thing in CIA. And Hunt put together all his enemies and all people he hated, and leaked. I think it's useless. Somehow he didn't come under Garrison's watch, as opposed to David Atlee Phillips, whom Mark mentioned, and who is, in the new update, I referred to some new information about David Atlee Phillips that you might like, which I got from a person who ran a CIA proprietary book publishing company. I didn't mention that in the book, but that's who is the source of the new information I have about David Atlee Phillips. A person introduced to me originally by Jim Lazar, sitting there.
Joan, thank you very much for what you do. I haven't read The Great Game in Cuba yet, but I'm really intrigued. Could you articulate why the CIA would be interested in sabotaging their own plot to kill Castro?
Very good question. Excellent. And the reason is that CIA wanted its resources to go to another venue. Cuba these wars that CIA is sponsoring now, and we see them, Afghanistan being the latest maybe, they're about duration. And that's what winning means, duration. Cuba, they could have polished off very quickly, but what about Vietnam now? A good decade of defense contracting money can enrich these CIA's clients. CIA doesn't operate on its own. It represents its clients, and if I could say the word, the imperial effort, empire, capitalism, but they don't operate just like out of this. They have an agenda, and they preferred Vietnam.
Hi. Can you go into more detail about why the CIA would be its intent on killing JFK in general?
That's a whole story. I have a chapter in the original book that you could look at. But see, John F. Kennedy was at war with CIA. John F. Kennedy, they were making policy, and President Kennedy thought, as soldier of fortune Gerald Patrick Hemming said to me, John F. Kennedy was the last president who thought he could take power. He's not going to cede power to a CIA the way Barack Obama has. Not in your lifetime. So Kennedy was starting to cut their budget, cut their mandate, what they could do, what they couldn't do, took away the U-2 program from them, and a whole list. There's a whole long list of things, efforts that John F. Kennedy was making to tame CIA, as per the op-ed piece that Mark Lane referred to that was published in the Washington Post. Oh, he was their bitter enemy because, as has been suggested here, really, what CIA needed was to keep itself as an institution as powerful as it could possibly be, keep its unlimited budget. I think it still has the unlimited budget. And anything that challenged that was like, it was a death threat to them. And President Kennedy got in the way, my opinion.
Joan, we have one over here to your left.
Oh.
Hi, Joan. I see your upcoming book is about Mac Wallace. Do you believe that Mac Wallace was involved in JFK's assassination, and do you go into any detail about that?
I did. I redid the entire fingerprint investigation. How's that? You have to get credit, because you know that Jay Harrison, the researcher, they found one unidentified print in the Warren Commission records, and so Jay got the idea, well, it was Mac Wallace. He was up there on the 6th floor. There's his print. So I hired a certified latent print examiner who happened to be an officer in the certifying organization and who had been in the organization when the two people that were hired to identify that print identified it in false affidavits. They weren't even certified at the time. They said they were. And he did the kind of computer, what is the word, digital analysis of the fingerprint. Thank you to the FBI that provided a magnificent photograph, now in the National Archives, of that photo of the print. Who would know? And the print examiner said, I'm not saying anything until I see a photograph. I'm not looking at all these tracings. No. And so what I call up, I had no idea. Out comes this magnificent, with so many levels of gray and intensities, and it proved without a doubt that that was not Mac Wallace's print. I can say that here for the first time.
Joan, here's one right over here.
Hi, Joan. Do you have any comment about the release of Lee Harvey Oswald's IRS tax returns, that kind of thing?
The expert on returns and releases and archives is sitting right here in the front row, Malcolm Blunt. And you might ask him about the IRS records, since he's the person in this world that knows those archives best. He's from the UK. And he helped me, and I dedicated my 2 books to him, Cuba and Haiti, my best friend.
I think we have time for one more. Is there one? No? Okay.
Well, thank you very much for listening to me.